Loner rancher refuses to bid on a black infant. At sunrise, 50 former slaves stand at his gate. The crowd pressed forward, their voices rising like vultures circling prey. In the center of the town square, on a wooden platform stained with years of commerce, sat a basket. Inside, wrapped in torn cloth, was a baby no older than 6 months. The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "What am I bid for this here, child? Strong stock, good for field work in 10 years' time. Do I hear $20? Hands shot up around the square. Men in worn hats called out numbers, treating the infant like livestock. The baby's dark skin glistened with sweat under the harsh sun. Tiny fists waving helplessly in the air. Women in the crowd turned their eyes away, but the men kept bidding. Standing at the edge of the crowd, Silas Garrett watched with stone-cold eyes. His weathered face showed no emotion, his calloused hands gripping the reins of his horse. At 45, Silas had built a reputation as the most successful rancher in 3 counties. He was also the loneliest. Ever since fever took his wife and daughter 5 winters ago, he spoke to no one unless business demanded it. The auctioneer's eyes found Silas in the crowd. Everyone knew the rancher's reputation for buying the strongest workers, paying top dollar for what he needed. "Mr. Garrett, surely you'll bid on this fine specimen. Current bid is $35. The entire square fell silent. All eyes turned to Silas. This was expected. This was how these things went. The powerful took what they wanted, and Silas Garrett was the most powerful man for miles around. Silas looked at the baby. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Pain, memory, something deeper than the crowd could understand. The infant's cries pierced the air, desperate and innocent. "No," Silas said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "I won't bid." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Men who had known Silas for years stared in shock. The auctioneer's hammer froze midair. In a town where human lives were bought and sold like cattle, the richest man had just walked away from an easy purchase. "But Mr. Garrett," the auctioneer stammered, "surely you need—" "I said no." Silas turned his horse around, his back to the platform. "Find another buyer." As he rode away, the crowd's whispers followed him like smoke. Some called him soft. Others wondered if grief had finally broken his mind. But in the shadows at the edge of the square, a woman in a faded blue dress watched him leave. Her name was Dinah Ross, and she had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone knew. The baby's cries grew louder as the bidding resumed, but Silas didn't look back. He couldn't have known that his refusal had set something in motion. Something that would bring 50 people to his gate before the sun rose again. Something that would force him to choose between the isolation he'd built around his heart and a fight that would define what kind of man he truly was. Silas rode hard toward his ranch, the dust cloud behind him matching the storm building in his chest. The town's whispers still echoed in his ears, but louder than any of them was the sound he couldn't escape. That baby's crying. It reminded him of another cry, another helpless voice he'd failed to save. His ranch stretched across the valley like a kingdom of solitude. Cattle grazed in distant fields, and the main house stood empty except for him. No laughter filled these rooms anymore. No small feet ran across these wooden floors. The silence had become his punishment, and he'd accepted it as the price for surviving when his family couldn't. But as Silas unsaddled his horse, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh hoofprints in the dirt around his property. Not just 1 or 2, dozens of them. Someone had been watching his land, circling it like wolves studying their prey. He grabbed his rifle from the barn and walked the perimeter. The tracks led in all directions, but they had one thing in common. They all ended at vantage points overlooking his house. Whoever had been here knew his daily routines, his blind spots, his weaknesses. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Silas spotted movement in the tree line. A figure on horseback, barely visible through the branches. Then another, and another. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted him to see them. His hands tightened on the rifle. In all his years of solitude, no one had dared approach his land uninvited. His reputation as a man who shot first and asked questions later had kept trespassers away. But these riders seemed different. They moved with purpose, with coordination that spoke of planning. Just as the sun touched the horizon, a single rider emerged from the trees. It was the woman in the faded blue dress, Dinah Ross. She rode with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her dark eyes fixed on Silas with an intensity that made him step back. She stopped just outside rifle range and called out, her voice carrying across the evening air like a prayer-turned weapon. "Silas Garrett, we need to talk." "Get off my land," Silas shouted back, raising his rifle. "I don't know what you want, but you won't find it here." Dinah didn't move. "You know exactly what we want. The same thing you wanted when you walked away from that auction. The same thing that's been eating at your soul since you lost your family." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. How could this stranger know about his deepest pain? How could she see through the armor he'd built around his heart? "You don't know anything about me," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "I know you're the only man in that square today who saw a baby instead of property," Dinah replied. "I know you're the only one who looked at that child and remembered what it means to be human." As darkness began to fall, more riders emerged from the trees. 10, then 20, then 30. All of them former slaves, all of them watching Silas with eyes that had seen too much suffering. But there was something else in their gaze. Hope. Desperate, dangerous hope. "What happens at sunrise changes everything," Dinah called out. "You can face it alone, or you can face it with us. But either way, Mr. Garrett, what started in that square today doesn't end until that baby is safe." The riders melted back into the darkness, leaving Silas alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that his days of isolation were about to come to a violent end. Silas spent the night pacing his empty house like a caged animal. Every shadow outside his windows could be a threat. Every sound in the darkness might be the prelude to violence. He'd loaded every rifle he owned and positioned them at strategic points throughout the house. But deep down, he knew weapons wouldn't solve what was coming. The woman's words haunted him. How did she know about his family? How did she know that seeing that baby on the auction block had torn open wounds he thought had healed? The memory of his daughter's final days crashed over him like a wave. Her tiny hand in his, her labored breathing, his complete helplessness as fever consumed her small body. He'd sworn never to feel that powerless again, never to care enough about another human being that losing them could destroy him. But something about that infant's cries had broken through his defenses, reminding him of who he used to be before grief turned him into stone. As dawn approached, Silas climbed to his roof to survey his land. The sight that greeted him made his blood freeze. They hadn't been lying about the 50. Riders emerged from every direction, from the hills, the forest, the distant valleys. Men and women on horseback, moving with military precision toward his ranch. At their head rode Dinah Ross, no longer alone but leading what looked like an army. But this wasn't an attack formation. As they drew closer, Silas could see they carried no weapons. Instead, they brought shovels, hammers, rope, and supplies. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't to destroy his property. The riders formed a perfect semicircle around his house, close enough to speak but far enough to show respect. Dinah dismounted and walked forward alone, her hands visible and empty. "Mr. Garrett," she called up to him on the roof, "we're not here to fight you. We're here to offer you something no one has offered you in 5 years." "And what's that?" Silas shouted down, his rifle still in his hands but no longer aimed. "A chance to save a life instead of watching one slip away." The words cut through him like a blade. Every person in that semicircle had lost someone to the cruel machinery of a world that treated human beings like property. They'd buried children, spouses, parents. They understood his pain because they carried the same scars. "That baby from the auction," Dinah continued, "was sold to Marcus Webb. You know Webb. He works children in his fields until they drop. That infant won't see his second birthday if we don't act." Silas felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Webb was notorious for his cruelty, a man who saw human suffering as the cost of doing business. "By noon today," Dinah said, "we're going to Webb's ranch to take that child. We're asking you to come with us, not because we need your guns or your money, because that baby needs someone who understands what it means to fight for family." The sun climbed higher, and Silas realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. Silas climbed down from the roof, his mind racing faster than his feet on the ladder rungs. 50 people had come to his land, people who had every reason to hate men like him, men who'd built wealth while they suffered in chains. Yet here they stood, asking for his help instead of demanding his blood. "You're planning to steal from Marcus Webb," Silas said as he approached Dinah. "That makes you outlaws. That makes anyone who helps you an outlaw, too." "We prefer the term liberators," Dinah replied with a grim smile. "And you're already an outlaw, Mr. Garrett. The moment you refused to bid on that baby, You declared war on a system that treats children like livestock. Silas looked at the faces surrounding him. Old men with scars on their backs from whips. Women who'd watched their own children sold away. Young men whose eyes held the kind of determination that came from having nothing left to lose. They weren't asking him to join a raid. They were asking him to remember what it meant to be human. Webb has 12 armed men on his property, Silas said. You're talking about a bloodbath. Maybe, Dinah nodded. But that baby is dying slowly every day he stays there. Sometimes a quick death is kinder than a slow one. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd made that same calculation 5 years ago, holding his dying daughter in his arms, wishing he could trade places with her. The helplessness had nearly driven him mad. There's another way, Silas said suddenly. Webb is a businessman above all else. He responds to money and pressure. What if we could make keeping that baby more expensive than letting him go? Dinah's eyes narrowed. What are you thinking? Webb supplies beef to half the territory. He needs my cattle more than he needs one infant. If I threaten to cut off his supply, make it clear that keeping that baby will cost him thousands in lost contracts, he might negotiate. Dinah finished. But what's to stop him from just taking the baby and running? What's to stop him from calling the law on all of us? Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The flutter of hope mixed with terror. If he did this, there was no going back. If he failed, that baby would suffer for his interference. If he succeeded, he'd have to live with caring about someone again, with the constant fear of loss that had nearly destroyed him before. Mr. Garrett, Dinah said softly, I know you're scared. We all are. But fear is just another word for love with nowhere to go. That baby deserves to have someone fight for him the way you wish someone had fought for your daughter. If you were Silas, what would you do? Risk everything to save a child you barely know, or protect yourself from the pain of caring again? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Silas decided next would either save an innocent life or damn them all. The sun climbed higher as 50 pairs of eyes waited for his answer. In the distance, smoke rose from Webb's ranch where a baby's fate hung in the balance. Silas looked at the faces surrounding him, then at his empty house behind him. For 5 years he'd chosen safety over connection, isolation over risk. But standing here now, he realized that safety was just another word for slow death. I'll come with you, he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. But we do this smart. No guns unless Webb forces our hand. We try negotiation first. The relief that washed over Dinah's face told him everything he needed to know about how desperate their situation really was. These people had been planning to charge into certain death rather than let that baby suffer another day. Within minutes, the group was moving. Silas rode beside Dinah at the front, feeling more alive than he had since his family died. The weight of isolation was lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something more dangerous, but infinitely more human. Purpose. How did you know? Silas asked as they rode. How did you know I'd lost a daughter? The way you looked at that baby, Dinah replied. The same way I looked at my son before they sold him south 15 years ago. Some pain leaves marks that only other broken parents can see. The confession hit Silas like a sledgehammer. This woman had been fighting for other people's children because she couldn't fight for her own. Just like him. As they crested the hill overlooking Webb's ranch, Silas felt his blood run cold. The property was more fortress than farm, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter and watchtowers at each corner. Webb had built his empire on fear and violence, and he'd prepared for war. Jesus, whispered one of the riders behind them. How are we supposed to get past that? But Silas was studying the layout with the eye of a military strategist. Webb's defenses were impressive, but they were designed to repel a direct assault. They weren't prepared for what he was planning. Dinah, take half the group around to the north pasture. Make yourselves visible, but don't approach. I want Webb to think you're planning to stampede his cattle. What about the other half? They stay here with me. We're going to walk right up to the front door and ask for a business meeting. The audacity of the plan sent murmurs through the group. Walk openly into the enemy's stronghold, while the others created a distraction. Webb knows me, Silas continued. He'll want to hear what I have to say, especially if he thinks there's money involved. Once I'm inside, I'll find that baby and assess our options. And if he decides to just shoot you? Dinah asked. Silas smiled grimly. Then you'll know negotiation is off the table. As the group split up, Silas felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. But this time, he wasn't carrying it alone. This time, 50 people were depending on him to do what he'd failed to do 5 years ago: save a child's life. The sun reached its peak as Silas rode toward Webb's front gate, knowing that the next hour would either redeem his soul or destroy it completely. The guards at Webb's gate recognized Silas immediately. His reputation as a successful rancher opened doors that would have remained locked for anyone else. Within minutes, he was dismounting in Webb's courtyard, his hands visible but his eyes scanning every shadow for threats. Marcus Webb emerged from his main house like a spider, sensing vibrations in his web. He was a thin man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. Everything about him screamed predator, from his expensive clothes to the way he positioned himself between Silas and the house. "Silas Garrett," Webb said, extending a hand that Silas reluctantly shook. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "Business, Marcus. Always business." Silas kept his voice level. "Professional. I understand you made a purchase at yesterday's auction." Webb's smile widened. "Ah, the infant. Smart investment. In 10 years, that boy will be worth 10 times what I paid. Assuming he survives, of course." The casual cruelty in Webb's voice made Silas's jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain calm. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss. I have a proposition that might interest you." "Oh?" Webb gestured toward the house. "Let's talk inside." As they walked through the front door, Silas heard it, the faint sound of an infant crying somewhere deeper in the house. His heart clenched, but he kept his expression neutral. The baby was alive, at least for now. Webb led him to a study lined with ledgers and contracts. Everything was about profit, about reducing human lives to numbers on a page. On the desk sat a glass of whiskey and a stack of bills of sale, including one with yesterday's date. "So what's this proposition?" Webb asked, settling behind his desk like a king on his throne. "I need workers for my spring cattle drive," Silas said. "Young ones who can be trained properly. I'm willing to pay premium prices for the right candidates." Webb leaned forward, interested. "And? I'll take that infant off your hands for triple what you paid. Plus, I'll guarantee you first pick of my cattle for the next 5 years at below market prices." It was a generous offer. Too generous. Webb's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why that particular child? There are plenty of others available." Silas had prepared for this question. "Fresh stock trains easier. No bad habits to break. Plus, I heard he's healthy despite his circumstances." From somewhere in the house, the baby's cries grew louder, more desperate. Silas could hear footsteps, voices, the sounds of everyday life continuing while a child suffered in captivity. Webb stood and walked to his window, looking out at his armed guards. "You know, Silas, I've heard interesting rumors about you lately, about your behavior at yesterday's auction, about riders gathering near your property." Silas felt ice forming in his veins. Webb knew. Somehow he'd learned about the rescue attempt. "I'm a businessman, Marcus. Nothing more." "Are you?" Webb turned back to face him, and now the predator's mask was gone. "Because it seems to me like you're running some kind of underground railroad operation, and that makes you very dangerous to men like me." The baby's cries suddenly stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the sound had been. "Here's my counteroffer," Webb continued. "You leave my property right now, and I won't have my men shoot you for trespassing. You stay, or you ever come back here, and I'll make sure that baby dies slowly while you watch." Silas realized with growing horror that he'd walked into a trap. Webb had been expecting him. Silas felt the walls closing in around him, but years of surviving in hostile territory had taught him to think under pressure. Webb expected fear, expected him to back down like most men would when faced with superior firepower. But Silas wasn't most men. "You're right, Marcus," Silas said, moving closer to the desk. "I am dangerous to men like you. But not in the way you think." Webb's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but Silas continued talking, his voice calm and measured. "See, you've built your whole operation on fear and isolation. You count on people being too scared or too alone to stand up to you. But what happens when they're not alone anymore?" Outside, shouts erupted from the courtyard. Webb spun toward the window, and Silas saw what had caused the commotion. Dinah's group wasn't just visible anymore. They were moving. And they weren't alone. More riders were appearing on every horizon, streaming toward the ranch from all directions. "What the hell?" Webb started, but Silas cut him off. "Word spreads fast in these parts. 50 people came to my ranch this morning, but when they left to come here, they stopped at every farm, every settlement, every place where decent people live. Turns out there are a lot more folks who are sick of your business than you realized." The baby's cries resumed from deeper in the house. But now they were accompanied by other sounds. Doors opening, footsteps running, voices calling out in alarm. Webb's fortress was being surrounded by an army of conscience. "This is insurrection," Webb snarled, drawing his gun. "I'll have every one of you hanged for this." "Maybe," Silas replied. "But first you'll have to survive it." The front door burst open, and Dinah Ross strode in with 3 other riders behind her. She moved through Webb's house like she owned it, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Where's the baby?" she demanded. Webb swung his gun toward her, but Silas was faster. Years of ranch work had kept him strong and quick, and he tackled Webb before the man could fire. They crashed into the desk, scattering papers and breaking glass. "Upstairs!" someone shouted from the hallway. "Second room on the left!" Dinah was already running, taking the steps 3 at a time. Silas pinned Webb to the floor, the gun skittering across the room. Through the broken window, he could see Webb's guards surrendering their weapons to the growing crowd outside. The fortress had fallen without a shot being fired. When Dinah returned, she was carrying a small bundle wrapped in clean cloth. The baby was thin, too thin, but his eyes were bright and alert. He'd survived. "It's over, Webb," Silas said, getting to his feet. "The game you've been playing for years ends today." But as they prepared to leave, Webb's laughter filled the room, cold, bitter, and full of promise. "You think this changes anything? You think rescuing one baby makes you heroes? This territory has 100 Marcus Webbs, and now you've declared war on all of them." Silas looked down at Webb, bleeding and defeated on his own floor, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Peace. Not the hollow quiet of isolation, but the deep satisfaction that came from fighting for something larger than himself. "You're right," Silas said. "There are 100 Marcus Webbs in this territory. But today there are also 100 people who stood up and said enough. Tomorrow there might be 200. Next week 1,000. Outside, the crowd was organizing itself with military precision. Former slaves worked alongside white farmers. Native Americans rode beside Mexican vaqueros. What had started as a rescue mission had become something larger, a coalition of conscience that crossed every line society had drawn. Dinah held the baby close to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "What's his name?" she asked softly. "Name?" Webb spat blood. "He's property. Property doesn't need names." "Then we'll give him one," Silas said. He looked at the infant's bright eyes and remembered another child, another life that had slipped through his fingers. "Samuel. His name is Samuel." The baby gurgled softly, as if approving of his new identity. In Dinah's arms, he looked less like property and more like hope itself. As they prepared to leave Webb's ranch, Silas realized that the 50 people who had come to his gate at sunrise had changed everything. They'd shown him that isolation wasn't strength. It was just another form of surrender. Real strength came from standing with others, from choosing to care despite the risk of loss. "What happens now?" Dinah asked as they mounted their horses. "Now we go home," Silas replied. "All of us. Together." The ride back to Silas's ranch was different from the morning's desperate charge. People talked, shared stories, made plans. Samuel was passed from rider to rider, each person taking a turn at protecting him. By the time they reached Silas's property, the baby had 50 new guardians. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, the group gathered in Silas's yard. For the first time in years, his land was filled with laughter, with conversation, with life. "Samuel will need a family," Dinah said, still holding the child. "Someone to raise him, to love him." Silas looked at his empty house, then at the people who had transformed from strangers into something resembling family. Maybe he doesn't need just one family. Maybe he needs all of us. And so Samuel became the first child of a new kind of community, one that refused to see human beings as property, one that chose love over fear, connection over isolation. Dinah moved into Silas's house to help care for the boy, and gradually others joined them. The lonely ranch became a refuge for anyone who needed protection, a symbol of what was possible when people chose to stand together. Marcus Webb was right about one thing. They had declared war on his kind of evil. But they'd also discovered something more powerful than any weapon, the unstoppable force of human decency when it finally decides to fight back. Years later, when Samuel was old enough to understand, Silas would tell him about the day 50 people stood at a gate and changed the world, about how sometimes the greatest victories begin with a single refusal to participate in cruelty. about how family isn't just blood, it's anyone willing to fight for your future. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. The loner rancher had found his purpose, the community had found its courage, and a baby named Samuel had found something no amount of money could buy, a home where he was loved simply for being human. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one. With a twist so powerful, it will remind you why hope always finds a way to win. Click on the video now.